Hello everybody, welcome back to Study is Key. That is, welcome back if you've been here before. If you've not been here before, welcome to the channel. Hopefully you'll stick around to the end of the video and then subscribe to the channel so you can stick around for future videos as well. In this video today, we're going to be taking a look at Romans 3:3. Now, the reason for that is some people often like to argue that the word pistis in Greek, often translated faith, is better understood or translated faithful. And one of the passages they'll point to in defense of this idea that pistis should be understood to mean faithful is Romans 3:3. It reads, "What if some were unfaithful? Does their faithlessness nullify the faithfulness of God?" And specifically, it's this phrase here that they'll point to, because the word here translated faithfulness by the ESV is pistis in Greek, and the argument goes something like this. God is omniscient. He knows all things. Therefore, whatever God knows, he fully knows, right? He doesn't believe things. Belief is something that you hold to be true, but you don't actually have full knowledge of it. And so God, it is said, is omniscient, and that's true. He knows all. So therefore, faith of God would not make sense, right? So on the surface, that seems to make good sense. It seems to be a good argument for why pistis here is probably better understood as faithfulness. But I think there's a much better, more sensible translation than faithfulness of God here. And so we're going to get into how language works a little bit, and we're going to unpack that. So let's just walk through Romans 3:3 first, a little bit more slowly, and see how much sense it makes coupled with verse 4 compared to this translation here that we have in the ESV. So the first sentence in verse 3 says, "What if some were unfaithful?" And the word translated unfaithful here is the verb apisteo, a being the negative prefix, and pisteo being a verb that sometimes means be unfaithful or to disbelieve. In 2 Timothy 2:13, for example, here is the same verb, apisteo. It says, "If we are faithless, he remains faithful." Now, the word translated faithful here in Greek is pistos. And pistos is the adjective, right? It's not the same as pistis. Pistis is the noun, pistos is the adjective, and the adjective pistos does in fact often mean faithful. And so it makes good sense here to have the word translated faithful. And because it's contrasted directly with this here, then it makes sense that this here would be translated are faithless instead of if we disbelieve, he remains faithful. That doesn't seem to make as much sense as if we are faithless, he remains faithful. That's a straightforward contrast. However, the verb apisteo sometimes does mean disbelieve. For example, Mark 16:11 says, "But when they heard that he was alive and had been seen by her, they would not believe it." Now, not believe here is apisteo. So sometimes it really does just mean disbelieve, and other times it means to be faithless. To not be faithful. Here's another example. In Acts 28:24, it says, "And some were convinced by what he said, but others disbelieved." Disbelieved is apisteo, and it's contrasted with being convinced, right? So some are convinced and others aren't. That is, they don't believe, they disbelieve. So going back to Romans 3:3 here, looking at the first sentence, here the word apisteo could, on the surface, be translated either unfaithful or what if some disbelieved, right? So either what if some disbelieved or what if some were unfaithful. On the surface, either translation could work. So let's keep working through the verse here. "Does their faithlessness nullify the faithfulness of God?" Now the word translated faithlessness here is apistia. In Matthew 13:58, for example, it says, "And he did not do many mighty works there because of their unbelief." Now unbelief here is apistia. They did not believe, and therefore Jesus did not do many mighty works there. In Romans 4:20, it says, "No unbelief, that is, no apistia, made him waver concerning the promise of God, but he grew strong in his faith," pistis, "as he gave glory to God, fully convinced that God was able to do what he had promised." So, growing strong in his pistis, his faith, means that he was fully convinced that God was able to do what he had promised. He grew strong in his faith to the point where he was fully convinced that God was able to do what he had promised. So pistis here very obviously refers to faith, And apistia here, by contrast, means unbelief. So it's well translated here by the ESV. No unbelief made him waver concerning the promise of God. Rather, he was fully convinced, right? He grew strong in his faith. Now, interestingly, when you look at BDAG, the gold standard of Greek lexicons, when you look at apistia, it gives two different possible definitions of the word. And the first one is unwillingness to commit oneself to another or respond positively to the other's words or actions. Lack of belief, unbelief. And it gives a number of biblical examples, some of which I just gave you. Then you get to the second definition, lack of commitment to a relationship or pledge, unfaithfulness. But look at the only biblical example it offers here of this meaning of apistia. Romans 3:3, the passage that we're looking at right now. So I, on the surface, would think that faithlessness here is most likely unbelief rather than faithlessness. Now, because the whole sentence says, does their apistia nullify the pistis of God, that does still seem to suggest that this would be translated faithlessness if we were to be most accurate, because that would seem to be a better fit here of what it goes on to say, right? It seems to be a better contrast. If God does not believe things, if he does not have faith, but knows all, then this has to be faithfulness, and this would most reasonably then be faithlessness rather than faith. But here's where this gets very interesting. The phrase faithfulness of God, as I said earlier, is translated this way because God is omniscient, he knows all things, and so therefore it doesn't make sense to speak of the faith of God. And so pistis of God here most reasonably then means faithfulness of God, not faith of God. But this overlooks a very important aspect of genitive constructions. Now, a genitive construction, put very simply, is this kind of construction you have here, right? X of Y, something of something else. And there are different kinds of genitives, right? There are subjective genitives that we call them, or objective genitives. And this here is translated as though we have a subjective genitive going on, right? The faithfulness of God. Now, let me just give you some examples to maybe clear up what subjective genitive means and objective genitive means. Subjective genitive, let's take the phrase love of God, for example. The phrase love of God can be understood either subjectively or objectively. Now, if you take it subjectively, what that means is you would understand the phrase love of God to refer to God's love, right? The love that God has. But you could also understand the phrase love of God objectively, meaning that God is the object of one's love. Think of the phrase, for example, this guy has such a astounding love of books. Now, love of books there refers to the love that one has for books, right? Books are the object of love. And so, again, the same is true with the phrase love of God. It can be understood subjectively, referring to God's love, or objectively, where God is the object of love, right? It's the love that we have for God. It's our love of God, just like you might speak of one's love of books. Now, I think that if you take this as an objective genitive, it actually makes a lot of sense instead of a subjective genitive. Because again, faith of God, pistis of God, if you take it subjectively, yes, I agree, it makes no sense at all. God knows all things. He doesn't believe things. He just knows things. But if you take faith of God objectively, that would place God as the object of faith. And so if you were to translate Romans 3:3 the way that I think it should be translated, consider how it would actually sound. What if some disbelieved or did not believe? Does their unbelief nullify the faith of God? That is, the faith about God. Think of the phrase story of redemption, for example, right? A story of redemption. What that means is a story about redemption. And so if you take pistis of God here objectively, you could understand it to mean nullify the faith about God. In other words, everything that we have to believe in relation to God, concerning God, then you would have, does their unbelief nullify the faith concerning God? In other words, the things that we ought to believe about God, if people don't believe it, does it nullify it? No. By no means. Let God be true, though everyone were a liar, as it is written that you may be justified in your words and prevail when you are judged. Now, do you see how much sense that seems to make of verse 4? If you leave it this way, if it has to do with faithfulness, it doesn't seem to make much sense of the flow. Verse 4 has to do with truth and lies. That seems to comport much better with belief, with faith, rather than faithfulness, right? Just let me read verses 3 to 4 as the ESV has them right now, and then I'll read it the way that I think Romans 3:3 should be read, and you be the judge of whether that seems to make better sense. What if some were unfaithful? Does their faithlessness nullify the faithfulness of God? By no means let God be true, though everyone were a liar, as it is written that you may be justified in your words and prevail when you are judged. So the connection isn't exactly clear, right, between faithfulness or faithlessness and truth versus lies. But if you take it this way, the way that I'm proposing, listen to how good it sounds. What if some did not believe? Does their unbelief nullify the faith about God? By no means. Let God be true, though everyone were a liar, as it is written that you may be justified in your words and prevail when you are judged. So if God calls us to believe certain things and people disbelieve it, that doesn't nullify the faith of God. That is the faith about God, right? What he calls us to believe, what we are to believe about God, is not nullified by the fact that people don't believe it. If people don't believe it, they're liars. God is true. What he calls us to believe is true. So even if everybody disbelieves it and prattles and says things opposite to the faith about God, that just makes them liars because God is true. So I think that this translation makes much more sense of the context of the flow between verses 3 and 4. And therefore, I think that verse 3 here in Romans 3 cannot be used to argue that pistis is better understood or translated as faithfulness. So even this one passage that is most often pointed to argue that pistis can and does sometimes refer to faithfulness in the New Testament, upon closer examination proves to actually not be support for that at all. So I think the ESV has some retranslating to do if they ever update their translation, and that goes for a number of other translations as well. Now, interestingly, let's just look at the NASB real quick. It translates the verse this way: "What then, if some did not believe," so far so good, "their unbelief," so far so good, "will not nullify the faithfulness of God, will it?" Just read the NASB replacing faithfulness with faith and understanding the genitive construction here to be an objective genitive. What then? If some did not believe, their unbelief will not nullify the faith about God, will it? May it never be. Rather, let God be found true, though every man be found a liar. As it is written, that you may be justified in your words and prevail when you are judged. So I hope this was interesting or informative to some of you out there. I'm somewhat of a Bible nerd, and these kind of little things are interesting to me, and they actually do have some relevance in some debates revolving around justification by faith. And so this is actually a relevant thing, right? Be ready for when people try to argue that faith means faithfulness and they point to this passage. You can remember this video and go, actually, I don't think that's true. I don't think that Romans 3:3 supports this idea at all. So as nerdy and sort of niche as this seems to be, this actually has some relevance in the justification debate. So I would say remember this video, learn the difference between an objective and a subjective genitive, and I think that you'll be able to do just fine if you're ever challenged on this verse and people try to use it to suggest that faith should be understood as faithfulness. All right, so like I said, that's all for today. I've already gone a little bit longer than I expected to with this one. So please like the video and comment. That helps the video be seen by more people. And ultimately, that also helps the channel grow. And you can also subscribe to the channel to help it grow. You can share the video. You can do all those things. I very much appreciate it when you do that. And so I'll see you guys in the next one. And until then, remember that study is key.